civilizations of the 20th century are not the first to founder on the rocks of debt and bankruptcy. Here is what the Encyclopaedia Britannica has to say about money control in the time of the Greeks and Romans. The bulk of the population, who had originally been small proprietors or tradesmen, became gradually indebted to the rich, to such an extent that they were practically slaves. Usury had given all the power of the state to a small plutocracy. And if we want to go back even further, to the time of Nehemiah in the Old Testament, we find the same thing was happening in the land of Israel. This is Nehemiah chapter 5. Now the men and their wives raised a great outcry against their Jewish brothers. Some were saying, "We and our sons and daughters are numerous. In order for us to eat and stay alive, we must get grain." Others were saying, "We are mortgaging our fields, our vineyards and our homes to get grain during the time of famine." Still others were saying, "We have had to borrow money to pay the king's tax on our fields and vineyards. Although we are of the same flesh and blood as our countrymen, and though our sons are as good as theirs, yet we have to subject our sons and daughters to slavery. Some of our daughters have already been enslaved, but we are powerless, because our fields and our vineyards belong to the others." The New Testament teaching that the love of money is the root of all evil has led to many comments from both Protestant and Catholic churchmen in subsequent ages. Christ's physical assault on the money changers in the temple, and his warning that no man can serve both God and money, have both been noted by the clergy and the laity.
This power becomes particularly irresistible when exercised by those who, because they hold and control money, are able to govern credit and determine its allotment, for that reason supplying, so to speak, the lifeblood of the entire economic body, and grasping, as it were, in their hands the very soul of production, so that none dare breathe against their will.
The colonization of America almost immediately created a preoccupation with money. The early settlers had brought limited supplies of gold and silver coins, which served briefly as a means of exchange. But as the spread westwards began, there was immediately a shortage of a ready means of exchange. So certain colonies began to print their own paper money, which they called colonial scrip. The colony of Massachusetts, for example, began to create and issue its own paper money, making it legal tender on July the 2nd, 1692. The money created by the leaders in Massachusetts was used for the settling of all private and public debts. It was used to cover government administration expenses and necessary capital works, and to lend to private citizens on a long-term, low-interest basis. Accrued interest went into consolidated revenue. Taxes were so low as to be almost non-existent. The colony itself paid no interest to anyone. The effect of a sound money system was so obvious and so startling that other colonies began to develop similar systems. A period of unparalleled prosperity resulted in the colonies, lasting almost 30 years. But the long tentacles of the bankers in England soon reached towards these upstarts in the colonies. From 1730 onwards, there was increasing pressure from the Bank of England to prohibit the colonists from issuing their own money, and to substitute the lending of banknotes from the mother country. In 1749, after bitter defiance from the colonies, the Resumption Act was passed, requiring the payment of all taxes and contracts in gold and silver. The enormous prosperity was almost immediately eroded to nothing. Prices fell, and trade ground to a halt. This, more than anything else, and mysteriously not explained in modern history books, led to the American Revolution. Britain prohibited the printing of any type of paper money in the colonies in 1764. This angered the colonists, and, led by the newspaper publisher Benjamin Franklin, they appealed to London for their right to print and issue paper money. But Britain adamantly refused. American President Thomas Jefferson spoke out against the power of the banks.
I believe that banking institutions are more dangerous to our liberties than standing armies. Already they have raised up a money aristocracy that has set the government at defiance. The issuing power should be taken from the banks and restored to the people to whom it properly belongs.
At a later period, in the mid-19th century, the famous American president, Abraham Lincoln, was forced to issue his famous greenbacks for the purpose of financing the Civil War. He had this to say about the banks of his day.
I have two great enemies, the Southern Army in front of me and the financial institutions in the rear. Of the two, the one at my rear is my greatest foe. The money kings wanted 24 to 36% interest for loans to our government to conduct the Civil War. The government should create, issue, and circulate all the currency and credit needed to satisfy the spending power of the government and the buying power of the consumers. The privilege of creating and issuing money is not only the supreme prerogative of the government, but it is the government's greatest creative opportunity. Money will cease to be the master and become the servant of humanity. Democracy will rise superior to the money power.
But Lincoln's sound advice never prevailed. After his assassination, the struggle continued, until in 1913, the Federal Reserve, which is a privately owned system, was enacted. How does it function, and what is its operation? On February the 25th, 1986, the Australian edition of the US magazine Newsweek carried the following article under the heading, "Making Money Out of Thin Air."
The Federal Reserve is the economic equivalent of the Kremlin. No institution is more powerful or more poorly understood. If the Federal Reserve wants to add funds, it simply buys government bonds on the open market. With the stroke of a few computer keys, the Fed creates money out of thin air, adding funds known as reserves to the account of the bond seller's bank. The bank is able to lend out those reserves several times over, creating even more money.
So the 20th century heralded in, with the establishment of the Federal Reserve in America, the idea of central or reserve banking, in which a banker's bank took control of the monetary and fiscal policy, almost independently of the government itself. And so a vast monopoly was established in each nation over the purpose, activities, and aspirations of its individual citizens. Out of such thinking came the United Nations and its ancillaries, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. So the much vaunted New World Order, with which so many international experts seem preoccupied, includes agreeing that the global monopoly of debt, through exclusive control of money creation, be accepted by Americans, Canadians, Europeans, New Zealanders and Australians, together with the Third World and other nations. Will we the people be asked for a decision? And what will the children of tomorrow say of our decision? Or will these policies be implemented whether we like it or not?